Picture this. A janitor mopping the lobby late at night. Someone you'd probably walk past without a second thought. But what if I told you that same janitor secretly spoke 9 languages? And when the CEO discovered his hidden gift, it didn't just shock the office, it changed the company forever. This is the unbelievable true story of how one man went from the janitor's closet to a corner office. Wait, what did you just say? Those were the exact words Mr. Anderson, the CEO of a massive international company, blurted out one late evening. The office was almost empty. Most employees had already gone home. The lights on the top floors dimmed, and only the quiet hum of air conditioning filled the silence. Anderson, however, had stayed behind. The next day, he was set to meet with a group of foreign clients, some of the most important in the company's history. The deal on the table was worth millions, but the biggest obstacle wasn't the product, the contract, or even the numbers. It was communication. With delegates from 5 different countries flying in, language barriers threatened to derail everything. Translators had been hired, yes, but Anderson still felt uneasy. He hated relying completely on others to understand his clients. As he gathered his notes and prepared to call in night, he heard something unusual echoing softly from the lobby downstairs. Curious, he paused. There, in the corner of the massive marble-floored hall, stood Carlos, the janitor. Mop in hand, bucket nearby, phone pressed to his ear. Normally, Anderson would have just walked past without a second thought. After all, Carlos was quiet, kept to himself, and most employees barely noticed him. But tonight was different. Carlos wasn't speaking English. He was speaking French. Not just broken French, but fluent, smooth, natural French like someone who had lived in Paris for years. Anderson stopped mid-step. He spoke enough French himself to recognize mastery when he heard it. He raised an eyebrow, but decided to keep listening quietly. A minute later, Carlos ended the call. Anderson shook his head, thinking maybe he had imagined it. But then the janitor's phone buzzed again. This time, when Carlos answered, Anderson's jaw nearly hit the floor. Mandarin. Perfect Mandarin. The CEO blinked in disbelief. The janitor, the man who scrubbed floors and emptied trash bins every night, was switching languages like flipping a light switch. Anderson couldn't contain himself. He stepped closer, blurting out, "Wait, what did you just say?" Carlos turned, startled. For a moment, he looked like a kid caught sneaking cookies before dinner. He lowered his phone and stammered, "Nothing, sir. Just a personal call." Anderson narrowed his eyes. That wasn't nothing. That was Mandarin. And before that, French. "Carlos, how many languages do you actually speak?" Carlos hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. He looked at the floor before finally whispering, "9, sir." Anderson froze. "9," he repeated, almost laughing in disbelief. "Did you just say 9? Carlos nodded shyly. "English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, German, Russian, Portuguese, and Japanese." The silence that followed was heavier than anything in that empty building. Anderson stared at the janitor, completely stunned. This was no ordinary employee, no ordinary man. And in that exact moment, the CEO realized he had just stumbled upon a hidden treasure inside his own company. The next morning, Mr. Anderson walked into the office with one thought looping in his head. 9 languages? He had barely slept. The image of Carlos, standing there with his mop and bucket while casually switching between French and Mandarin, replayed over and over. It didn't add up. How could a man with such extraordinary talent end up working as a janitor? As soon as he spotted Carlos quietly wiping down the lobby windows, Anderson approached him. This time, he wasn't going to let the mystery slide. "Carlos," he began casually, "how many languages do you actually speak?" Carlos froze mid-swipe. His shoulders tensed, and for a brief second, he looked like he wanted to run. Then, with a nervous smile, he turned toward his boss. 9, sir," he admitted, almost whispering the words like a confession. "English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Arabic, German, Russian, Portuguese, and Japanese." Anderson's jaw nearly hit the floor. He repeated the word back in disbelief. Louder this time, 9. Carlos nodded shyly. His eyes darted away, as if embarrassed to admit it. Yes, sir. 9. The CEO was stunned. This man cleans floors at night, yet he speaks more languages than most ambassadors. It didn't make sense. Carlos, Anderson said, shaking his head in shock. You're working here as a janitor? With a gift like that? Carlos took a deep breath, leaning against his mop handle. His voice was calm, but there was a sadness hidden underneath. Back home, he began softly. I was a professor of linguistics. I taught students, wrote papers, traveled to conferences. Languages have always been my passion. But when I moved to the U.S., things didn't go the way I planned. Anderson listened closely, intrigued. Carlos continued. My teaching credentials didn't transfer. Universities here said I needed more exams, more certifications. But I didn't have the money. My family needed food, rent needed to be paid, and survival doesn't wait for paperwork. So I took the first job I could find. This one, being a janitor. It was stable, honest work. It kept the lights on. And over time, I stopped telling people about my past. Nobody here needed a janitor who spoke 9 languages. His words hit Anderson like a punch to the chest. He realized the man standing before him wasn't just some invisible employee in the background. He was an unpolished diamond hidden in plain sight. The CEO stared at Carlos in disbelief. A linguistics professor reduced to mopping floors. All because life had pushed him into the shadows. Anderson couldn't believe it. This man wasn't just sweeping floors. He was carrying around a treasure worth more than gold. And in that moment, one thing became crystal clear. Carlos's story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. That very week, Anderson felt the pressure mounting. The deal ahead wasn't just important. It was make or break for the company. Delegates from Japan, France, Russia, Germany, and the Middle East were flying in, each with their own expectations, concerns, and demands. The problem? Language. Yes, translators had been hired, but Anderson knew the risks. A single mistranslation could derail months of negotiation. A wrong word, an incorrect tone, or a cultural slip could cost the company millions. Anderson couldn't shake the memory of Carlos revealing his hidden gift. An idea formed in his mind. It was bold, risky even, but what did he have to lose? That evening, Anderson found Carlos sweeping the conference room floor. Carlos, he said carefully, I need to ask you something unusual. Would you be willing to sit in during the meeting tomorrow? Just in case something goes wrong. Carlos blinked, stunned. Me? Sir, I'm just a janitor. No one will take me seriously. Anderson smiled. You're not just anything. You might be the key to saving this deal. Please, just be there. Carlos hesitated, but the sincerity in Anderson's voice won him over. With a nervous nod, he agreed. The next morning, the office was buzzing like a hive. Sleek black cars pulled up outside, and delegates stepped out in crisp suits, their translators and assistants trailing behind. Inside, the conference room gleamed, polished wood table, sparkling water glasses, and perfectly aligned folders. Carlos entered quietly, dressed in the same janitor's uniform he always wore. He tried to make himself invisible as he set bottles of water at each chair. To the delegates, he was just part of the background. To the employees, he was just the janitor. Nobody gave him a second glance. Then it happened. The Japanese delegate began speaking rapidly, laying out concerns about delivery schedules. The hired translator stumbled, fumbling for words, misphrasing key points. The delegate frowned, growing frustrated. The room tensed. And that's when Carlos, with quiet confidence, stepped forward. In perfect Japanese, he repeated the delegate's words, smoothly, respectfully, with the correct tone. The delegate's face lit up in relief. The entire room froze. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did the janitor just speak Japanese? Before anyone could react, the French delegate chimed in, testing him with a long statement. Without missing a beat, Carlos translated it flawlessly. Next came Arabic, then Russian, each language handled as if he had been born speaking it. The translators put down their headsets, wide-eyed. Assistants exchanged stunned glances. And the CEO? He leaned back in his chair, hiding a proud smile. One by one, Carlos bridged gaps that had seemed impossible just moments earlier. Tension melted into laughter, misunderstandings turned into agreements, and the deal, once hanging by a thread, began to take shape. By the end of the meeting, the impossible had happened. Every single delegate was smiling, shaking hands, and nodding in approval. The contract was signed. The deal was sealed. And then, something extraordinary occurred. The delegates, all of them, rose to their feet and applauded. Not for Anderson, not for the company, but for Carlos, the janitor who had saved the day. The entire office stared in shock, jaws hanging open. The man they had overlooked every day had just carried the company on his shoulders. Their janitor had just saved a multi-million-dollar deal. The office had gone quiet after the whirlwind meeting. Delegates had departed with smiles. Translators packed up their unused notes, and employees were still buzzing about what they had just witnessed. But one person wasn't celebrating: Carlos. Instead of standing in the spotlight, he had slipped back into the shadows, quietly picking up empty cups and straightening chairs like nothing extraordinary had happened. To him, it was instinct. He wasn't used to attention. Years of being invisible had taught him that blending in was safer. But Anderson wasn't going to let him disappear this time. Later that evening, the CEO called Carlos into his office. Nervously, Carlos walked down the hallway. His heart raced. What if I'd overstepped? What if I embarrassed him in front of the delegates? He pushed open the door, clutching his cap in his hands like a schoolboy about to face the principal. "Mr. Anderson, sir," Carlos began, his voice low. I'm sorry if I did too much earlier. I didn't mean to make anyone uncomfortable." Anderson stood from behind his desk and walked toward him. His expression was unreadable. For a moment, Carlos's stomach dropped. He was certain he was about to be scolded. But then, Anderson extended his hand. His grip was firm, his tone filled with pride. "Carlos," he said, locking eyes with him, "you don't belong in the janitor's closet. You belong at the head of our international communications team." For a moment, Carlos just stood there, stunned. He blinked rapidly, his mind trying to process the words. What?" he whispered. Anderson chuckled warmly. "You just saved the biggest deal of the year. You proved in a single afternoon that you have more skill, more poise, and more value than most professionals I've met in this industry. You're not just a janitor. From this day forward, you're my director of global relations." Tears welled up in Carlos's eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. For years, he had accepted the mob as his only destiny. For years, his brilliance had been locked away in silence. And now, in a matter of minutes, his entire life had been rewritten. The very next week, the announcement spread across the company like wildfire. Employees who once brushed past Carlos without a second glance now stood in line to shake his hand. His nameplate, once absent, now gleamed on a polished door. Director of Global Relations, Carlos Ramirez. The mop and bucket were gone. In their place stood a sleek desk in a corner office with glass walls that overlooked the city skyline. His paycheck? Tripled. His responsibilities? Enormous. But for the first time in years, Carlos felt alive. He wasn't just working a job anymore. He was living his purpose. Anderson often told the story to new hires. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Sometimes, the person you think has the least to offer has the power to change everything. For Carlos, that power had finally been recognized. News of Carlos's story spread across the company like wildfire. It wasn't just whispered in the hallways anymore. It became the story everyone wanted to talk about. The janitor who had spoken 9 languages and saved a multi-million-dollar deal was now the most talked-about man in the entire building. Employees who had once brushed past him in the lobby without a second glance now stopped to shake his hand. Some asked him to teach them phrases in Japanese or French. Others just wanted to say, "Congratulations, Carlos. We're proud of you." For the first time in years, Carlos felt seen. Truly seen. No longer was he just the man with the mop. He was a leader, a teacher, and an inspiration. But Anderson didn't stop there. The CEO knew that Carlos's story was bigger than one man's promotion. It was a lesson for everyone in the company and, perhaps, for the world. At the next all-staff meeting, Anderson stood before hundreds of employees and shared what had happened. He told the story of how he had overheard Carlos speaking French in a lobby, how he had later watched him switch to Mandarin, and how, when the moment came, Carlos had risen to the occasion and changed the course of the company's future. Anderson's voice rang out clearly. Never underestimate the person standing quietly in the corner. Talent, intelligence, and greatness can be hidden behind the most ordinary uniforms. Every person in this company matters. Every voice deserves to be heard. If we only judge people by their titles, we miss out on the treasures they carry within. The room erupted in applause. Many employees had tears in their eyes. Carlos sat near the front, humbled but proud. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but in that moment, he realized something important. His story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been overlooked, ignored, or underestimated. From that day forward, the culture of the company began to shift. Managers looked more closely at their teams. Supervisors encouraged employees to share hidden talents. People who once stayed quiet at meetings began speaking up, inspired by Carlos's courage and recognition. And Carlos? He embraced his new role with humility. As Director of Global Relations, he traveled with Anderson to international meetings, serving as both translator and cultural bridge. Delegates who had once struggled through interpreters now marveled at the man who could switch seamlessly between languages. But no matter how high he climbed, Carlos never forgot where he started. He often visited the janitorial staff, chatting with them in Spanish, Arabic, or whichever language made them feel most at home. He reminded them, and himself, that dignity exists in every role, whether it's cleaning floors or signing contracts. The office would never forget the day their janitor stunned them all. Because Carlos wasn't just the man who once cleaned the floors. He became the man who cleaned away the dust of doubt and revealed what true potential really looks like. And his story would continue to inspire, long after the applause faded. And that's how Carlos, the janitor everyone ignored, became the Director of Global Relations, proving that greatness can hide in the most ordinary places. His story reminds us of one powerful truth: never underestimate the quiet ones. Behind every uniform, every smile, every unnoticed face, there might be a genius waiting to be discovered. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because somewhere out there is another Carlos, and their story might be the next one we tell.